Good evening. I'm Mark Hamrick, a broadcast journalist for the Associated Press and the 104th president of the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists. And I'm here to welcome you on behalf of our Eric Friedheim National Journalism Library. Tonight's event benefits our 501c3, and we do thank you for that support, which goes to journalism training, scholarships, and press freedom issues. I also want to thank our library staff, led by Julie Hsu, our executive director of the National Press Club, Bill McCarran. I am honored to have the opportunity to kick things off tonight as we celebrate the work of our remarkable club member, Mr. Marvin Kalb, a winner of our Fourth Estate Award, with whom we collaborate so often. But tonight's event is really something special, bringing together their father-daughter journalist team. And so with Mr. Koppel also here tonight, we're honored by the presence of all of you. One housekeeping item, we respectfully ask that you turn off all sound on mobile devices. And a reminder that at the conclusion of tonight's event, Deborah and Marvin Kalb will sign copies of their book right over here. So now I'm pleased to introduce the executive producer of the Kalb Report series, GW professor and director of the GW Global Media Institute, and our friend, Mr. Mike Friedman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark Hamrick, and good evening, everybody. This marks our GW Global Media Institute's third collaboration this season with the Eric Friedheim National Journalism Library here at the National Press Club. But tonight is a family event, a very special opportunity to gather friends and colleagues to honor journalist Deborah Kalb and her father, Marvin Kalb, on the publication of their extraordinary new book, Haunting Legacy, Vietnam and the American Presidency from Ford to Obama. I've had the honor and pleasure of partnering with Marvin Kalb for 17 years now on our Kalb Report series here at the National Press Club. For the past 5 years, my colleagues and I have watched in awe as Marvin and Deborah have spent seemingly every free waking hour on the research for this book. That research has run the gamut from high-tech engagement to a lot of good old-fashioned shoe leather journalism. The result of this effort is a substantive, thoughtful, and thought-provoking volume that bridges generations and is in one fell swoop both historical and very current. Joining us tonight to guide our discussion is another iconic journalist who, like Marvin, represents the gold standard of the profession, Ted Koppel. Before we begin, special thanks for helping to make this evening possible to Julie Hsu, director of the Friedheim Library, Heather Date, the associate director of the George Washington University Global Media Institute, Lindsay Underwood, the newest member of our team who graduated from the GW School of Media and Public Affairs just last month, and as well as Colleen Shelby, who is a new graduate of GW and one of our current students, Drew Spence. With that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome journalists Deborah Kalb, Marvin Kalb, and Ted Koppel.
I must say I'm particularly relieved to hear that Marvin and Debbie only worked on this book during their waking hours. I must tell you, by way of introduction, that I am particularly grateful to have had one of the Kalb brothers as a competitor for almost 40 years now. In fact, it's probably more than 40 years. When I was bureau chief in Hong Kong for ABC, Bernie Kalb was bureau chief for CBS. And then in 1971, when I came back here to the United States as diplomatic correspondent, I was blessed to have Marvin as a competitor. As many of you who are in the field of journalism know, our friends tend to become the people who have been our competitors, because by definition, we don't travel with other reporters from our network or wire service or newspaper. We only travel with competitors. But I'm especially grateful to have had the Kalb brothers as competitors. And we are going to begin, before we get to Marvin and Debbie, with just a few words, although I must say I'm kind of nervous. It was a tactical mistake to put a microphone in Bernie Kalb's hand. Once it is there, it's going to be difficult to extract it again. But Bernie, would you...
Do I have a half hour?
No. Would you set the scene for us by reminding the many people in the audience here who may not be old enough to remember, how did we end up getting so intricately involved in Vietnam in the first place?
Let me begin by saying, for me, this is a night of very heavy quelling. I've got my dear brother, my dear niece, and my dear friend Koppel, and the three of them are going to provide an extraordinary insight into the writing of a book, into the perceptions, the analysis in the book, and altogether, I'd like to just add that over the years, I have earned a reputation for being absolutely fearless as a reporter, famous for my objectivity, absolutely uninfluenced by anybody, and I would like to offer a review of this book. And in that spirit, I would call it a rave review. It's ironic, I must say, it's terribly ironic to see Marvin and Debbie here writing a book about Vietnam. After all, I made my first visit to Vietnam in 1956. You can do the arithmetic. In 1956. In 1956, Debbie obviously was not on the scene. Marvin in 1956 could not read, could not write, and certainly could not pontificate. But when I see this book, and the page I really encourage you to read is the dedication. The dedication is quite marvelous, and I told Marvin that I always buy all the books that are dedicated to me. Ironic, desperately ironic. I've talked to Marvin. My visits to Vietnam were endless. I spent years covering the war in Vietnam, a bit for CBS, a bit for the New York Times, many years for CBS News, and we're lucky tonight to have with us somebody who wrote the first great book a generation ago about Vietnam, Stanley Carno, who wrote the great book called Vietnam. What to say? What to say? Marvin, Debbie, taking a bite of this story is quite extraordinary. Vietnam, for many people, has drifted off the front page of even their emotions. But for people like me, Vietnam never lets go. I have this deal with Vietnam. I don't let go of Vietnam. Vietnam does not let go of me. I go to Vietnam as often as I can. I must have been there about 8 times in the past decade. I spend my time mostly in the enemy's capital, Hanoi. How many people have visited Hanoi? Ooh. About 10. This will let me speak with even greater authority. I spend... Hanoi is my place. Saigon, where Saigon fizzled out on the war, we've gone through that, read Stanley's book. But this is a night to celebrate their book, Debbie's and Marvin's. I've gone through it meticulously searching for errors. I figured that would give me great pleasure, but I must say so far, I've read the book twice. Marvin generously has said it's not necessary for me to memorize it. I've read the book. I find it an overdue contribution to the literature of Vietnam. Vietnam is the 800-pound gorilla that is always in the Oval Office when the president has to make a decision about war and peace. Vietnam does not go away. The dead, the wounded, the cost, the ripping impact of Vietnam on America. We know those years, those of us who were around in those days. And so for Marvin to catch up the haunting legacy, the uninvited, the unwelcome guest at the Oval Office all the time, Vietnam, may it stay there. May it introduce sanity and wisdom and prudence to all American decisions to remember what happened in Vietnam before we embark on strange and odd and curious adventures. Thank you.
Bernie, if your brother and your niece ignore my questions as successfully as you did, it's going to be a long evening. The story, no, you get no second chances here, that's it. The story is told about Winston Churchill at a dinner which he clearly did not enjoy, turning to his hostess and saying about the dessert, "Madam, this pudding has no theme." Debbie, what's the theme of your pudding?
The theme of the pudding, well, I think there's a number of themes in it, but I think the main theme really is that Vietnam doesn't go away. It's there. Every president has to deal with it. It's there every time they have to make a decision about sending troops somewhere. It's there in the politics in terms of what happened in different elections about whether someone served or didn't serve or chose to go to Vietnam or not. It doesn't go away, and that's the theme that carries through the book, through each president that we look at.
And yet, Marvin, Vietnam clearly has affected different presidents in, one might almost say, diametrically opposed fashions. How is that possible?
Sometimes diametrically opposed, but there are two levels here. On one level, you have to imagine what are the major influences on all of the presidents since the end of the Vietnam War, when they have to decide, as Debbie was saying, about sending troops to fight. The Vietnam ghost is there, and as Bernie was saying, it's there all the time. However, each president operates in his own environment. Each president operates in his own time. And each president is operating on a particular problem. So that while the overall ghost is there, with any specific president, you're going to get a different response. For example, 1983, 241 American Marines are murdered in Beirut, Lebanon, by a terrorist group known to the president, known to the people around the president. They knew where they were. And yet, Ronald Reagan decided that because the American people, he said, had been spooked by Vietnam, he did not want to put them through another experience like that. And so for him, after the killing of 241 Americans, he did nothing. And that was remarkable, but that was because of Vietnam. On the other side, go to a president like Bush 1. The Iraqis go into Kuwait. It is seen as a direct threat to the United States. Bush 1 decides to do something, and pursuant to the Powell Doctrine, which is a direct consequence of the Vietnam War, President George H.W. Bush sends 500,000 Marines, troops, to do something that Powell told us later could have been done by 180,000, probably even fewer. But because of Vietnam, he wanted to send in many, sort of overloading the circuit, as it were, to make absolutely sure that the job is done, you go in, you do it fast, and you get out. That idea is so different from our experience in Vietnam. So a president, yes, can do it in different ways, but is always shadowed by this haunting legacy.
And yet, let's come to the present day. Here we are engaged, albeit not on the ground, but engaged in Libya, where no U.S. interest, no significant U.S. interest appears to be involved. We have no sense of how we're going to get out again. And the engagement, to the degree that there is any engagement, is rather timid. Is that too a function, Debbie, of Vietnam as perceived by President Obama and his advisors?
The Libya situation is interesting because, I mean, what's going on today, for example, does go right back to Vietnam. The War Powers Act, congressional involvement, the arguments between the executive and Congress over who really is in charge of sending troops, of fighting, what constitutes fighting, how do you really define that? And that was some of what was going on the Hill today in terms of the votes in the House about whether it was okay to send the troops, whether they should be stopped from engaging in particular actions. And that, again, goes back to Vietnam, and Congress wanted more say in what was happening. So.
And yet, Marvin, we appear to have come no further in the past 40 years than where we were. The congressional vote, albeit, as Debbie said, the vote in the House today was against funding
Right.
the military action against Libya, but it's meaningless. They will continue funding it anyway.
They will continue the funding, and what to me was very striking was that when the United States got involved in Libya, one of the things that President Obama said right from the beginning, he said, our involvement is going to be measured in days, not weeks. Well, it's 4 months plus now. Why did he say that? Because on his mind, this is a very smart, well-read president. He reads history all the time, I'm told. Now, Vietnam is very much on his mind, and he did not want to convey the impression to the American people that we're getting sucked into something that could end up being another Vietnam. This was a man who, when he was campaigning in '08, he went off to do the obligatory trip where you visit the war front. And he was going there with Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island and Chuck Hagel of Nebraska, Democrat-Republican. It's a 14-hour flight from Washington into Kuwait, as you know. And for most of that 14 hours, according to both senators, what was on this senator's mind was Vietnam and the lessons of Vietnam. Because he was going to Afghanistan and he was going to Iraq, and he wanted to learn from these two men, what was the relevance here? Is it possible that I'm missing something? And he kept on asking them questions about Vietnam over and over again, and they were both amazed that he sat there and listened. They both said he's a great listener. And the first time, when he goes into his first National Security Council meeting, the first point he makes to his people is, quote, Afghanistan is not Vietnam. Well, why does he have to say that at the very beginning, unless he thinks there's the possibility that we are getting into another Vietnam? And somebody like Bruce Riedel, who does books also for the Brookings Press, Bruce at that time was writing and thinking through the president's first strategy paper on Afghanistan. And Bruce told us that the ghosts of Vietnam walked the corridors of the White House every day. He found that to be the case.
And yet, explain to me for a moment how it is that those ghosts can affect different presidents in such extraordinarily different fashion. For example, Jimmy Carter, in trying to go into Iran to rescue the hostages, underplays it militarily and ends up with a disaster on his hands. Then you had George H.W. Bush, who, as you just said a moment ago, in effect overplayed it by sending 500,000 troops into Iraq and Kuwait. Same Vietnam, theoretically the same lessons to be drawn, and yet here are two presidents drawing diametrically opposed.
Sure, it's the same lessons to be drawn, but these are different people functioning in different political climates and environment and seeing issues in different ways. I mean, the idea that a Republican would see it one way and a Democrat another way is, you know, that's sort of ABC. What I find especially interesting is that as the years go by, you would think, well, this war ended really in 1975. Why is it bugging me today? But it is. How you respond to the bug is an individual thing, depending on the politics of the moment, the challenge that you face. Somebody may feel you've got to go in full bore and send in many more troops than you need, or with Obama in Libya, whoops, this will be done in a couple of days, don't worry about it. You go in either direction, but you go there for the pressure that the memory of Vietnam has produced.
Let me challenge you just a little bit on the suggestion that it's somehow a partisan matter, Democrat, Republican.
That's one of the reasons.
Well,
one of the reasons.
Let me challenge you on that one. Ronald Reagan, if ever a president in recent memory has a memory of being or a reputation of being broad-shouldered, tough, not going to take any crap from anyone, it's Ronald Reagan.
Absolutely.
And yet, as you correctly point out, in the wake of 241 U.S. Marines
right.
and Navy personnel being killed in Beirut, and what you didn't add is that the intelligence showed them that the Iranians and the Syrians were directly involved in the creation of what was then a completely newfound organization, Hezbollah.
It's in the book.
It's in the book. That's right. He did nothing. He did worse than nothing. He pulled those Marines who were in Lebanon at the time, pulled them out to waiting ships offshore. The ships stayed there for a few days, and then off they went.
Right.
And nobody said a word about it because, fortunately for President Reagan, there was another war, tiny one, a successful one, Grenada, that took place at exactly the same time, right? But here is the essence of a Republican tough guy who reacted to Vietnam, you say, and reacted in a fashion that would have done any liberal Democrat proud.
Absolutely. And I have to tell you that when I approached the research on that chapter and was thinking about Reagan, I approached it with memories of Reagan that I carried with me even at the time that I was covering the man, which was that this is a Hollywood, he's an actor. There's nothing, and there's no great depth there. And I have to tell you that reading his diary and reading the letters that he wrote, thousands of letters over a lifetime in politics, if you have any fairness within you, you have to judge this guy in a totally different way. And that's one of the things that I learned, by the way, in researching the Reagan chapter. I just had a different sense of the guy than I had before. And that's one of the wonderful things about doing a book of this sort, where you can have a buddy like Debbie at my side as you sort of discover whole new worlds. It's really a most exciting phenomenon.
Just finish off that thought on Reagan. Different how?
I'm not saying it's different. I'm saying that
No,
Reagan...
No, you said your appraisal of Reagan after you had read all of this
there was
different.
a greater... What I mean, Ted, is that there was... I appreciated the man in a broader way, and I was saying to myself, as sort of vistas opened for me in my understanding of this man, it said something also about journalism to me, that we approach the coverage of somebody perhaps too simplistically, and we ought to be a bit fairer to the presidents who have this enormous responsibility of sending people off to die. That's a terrible thing. And somebody like Reagan, looking at what could have happened in the Middle East, said, no, I'm not going to do it. And Vietnam was on his mind, and the word was spooked, and he didn't want the American people to be spooked yet again. Because it was Reagan, he could use both Grenada and language and that wonderful shoulder gesture that he had, and people would say, well, it's all okay, because President Reagan said so.
I must say I was struck as I read the book with what you just say, that with one notable exception, all the presidents, no, maybe two, most of the presidents since Ford come out looking a lot better and a lot stronger seen retrospectively. The only exceptions are Jimmy Carter and George W. Why, Debbie?
Well, I think Jimmy Carter, that's a great question. Jimmy Carter did not come out looking so great in the end, because the last part of the chapter on Jimmy Carter had to do with the Iran hostage situation and the failed rescue attempt. They're actually, the first bits of the Carter chapter, he was actually doing fairly well with a lot of different, with the Middle East, with China, with a lot of areas that he was working on. But he was completely undone by the hostage situation and by the outcome of that rescue mission, which was a complete disaster. So I think that it's sort of, if you took the Carter chapter and his presidency had stopped before that, it would have been viewed as something of a success in terms of foreign policy, at least. You know, maybe not on the domestic side, but I think that it was that last year or so of his presidency, and that's why he came out in that way, because that was the end of the chapter.
George W.?
Well, George W. Bush is interesting. I mean, he was completely, the 9/11 and the whole war on terrorism kind of overshadowed that chapter, as it did overshadow his whole presidency. And I think that at the time, I mean, we were working on this book during that whole time, during his presidency, not the entire presidency, we were working on it for the second half of his presidency. And I think that that chapter on Bush too, it was at the time of the end of his presidency, you did have situations going on that were unresolved and that were not going well. And it was not a situation that you would want to say, okay, here's a very successful outcome as he was leaving office. I don't think anybody would really say that. So I think it was a result of both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And then we get into the 2 chapters on Obama where you're still dealing with Afghanistan, and that is still going, obviously still continuing, and is in the news this week as well.
It's, there was one line, I mentioned it to you before we came out here, Marvin, in the president's speech to the nation a couple of nights ago. I don't have the exact language of it. I'm sure one of you sitting here does, but there was reference to a light in the distance. And I think any one of us here over the age of 50 or 60 must have thought to himself or herself, a light off in the distance. I still remember Lyndon Johnson talking about that light at the end of the tunnel, and how, you know, the joke in Vietnam was it was probably some Viet Cong with a flashlight.
But there's a deep sadness that I feel, I mean, when you even raise that, he knows that. He knows about the light at the end of the tunnel. He's read all those books. That's why he played around with the phraseology, so it's not the light at the end of the tunnel. But that's what he's thinking. That's in his mind. And that, to me, is overpoweringly sad, because it suggests that at the end of the day, he really doesn't know how we're going to get out of there. He's playing with different formulas. He's kicking the can down the road. When he started in December of '09, when he said he's going to have the surge troops go in, those were 30,000. They didn't get there until the summer, the tail end of the summer of 2010. And so they've had one fighting season, and they claim to have done quite well. Well, fine. But at this particular point, you can be sympathetic to the military point of view and say, well, if you wanted to get another 2 or 3 seasons of fighting in, you could really hurt the other guys. General Petraeus, when he went out there in the summer of 2010, told a number of his people that the most important thing for us right now is to hurt them bad. Then they'll come to the negotiating table and we'll be able to strike a deal. The only thing wrong with that, I have the highest respect for the General Petraeus, but the only thing wrong with that idea is that the Taliban may have a totally different vision of what's going on. They may have in mind that you can say whatever you like, Mr. President. We're here, and we're going to be here long after you leave.
Exactly.
And so,
I mean, you took my next question, and you have already begun to answer it, but let's take it all the way. If there was a central message to be taken out of Vietnam, that surely was it. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were on home turf. They had nowhere to go. And if there is a comparison to be drawn, and sometimes I worry that we overdraw them.
Sure.
I think there are strategic reasons why we are in Afghanistan which don't apply or didn't apply to Vietnam. But just focus on that one central issue, and maybe, Debbie, you would follow up whatever incomplete answer your father gives.
Well, I think that really there are analogies between the two, definitely. And I think that if you look at what was going on, like my father said in the very first meeting that Obama had with his foreign policy team. Yeah.
Co-author.
Yeah, my co-author, not my father, right. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Can I be your co-father?
So that in the very first meeting he talked about Afghanistan is not Vietnam. I think it's always been there in their mind as something that is a comparison. And yes, you could say, well, there definitely are reasons that the U.S. went into Afghanistan that are strategic, that are important, and that are different from why the U.S. went into Vietnam. And there's a lot of differences too. But I think that in the end, that's true, that what is going to be in a lot of people's minds, like if they see the president on TV talking about troop levels, that does go back in people's mind to Vietnam. It's just something that is going to keep reverberating when you hear that sort of language going on. And I think that what is really interesting is just whatever President Obama was trying to do with the speech, he's going to get criticism from either side anyway. In fact, he is getting criticism from both sides. You know, whatever action he would have decided to take with those levels about how much is really needed, how to deal with the Taliban, it ends up with criticism from people who are saying you're pulling the troops out too slowly, and on the other side, people who are saying, yeah, that it's too quick. You know, so he had to take something of a middle course on that. But I do think that Vietnam was in his mind and is in his advisor's mind, and it's just not going away. So
if you listen carefully, Marvin, to what people like General Petraeus are saying, mm-hmm. and they don't say things like this lightly. They're really saying, if you want to win this kind of a war, we're talking 20 years, 50 years even. This is a generational thing that the Pentagon, for a while there, kept referring to as the long war. Nobody uses that phrase anymore. That surely has to be one of the lessons of Vietnam also. I'm not sure if we could have won Vietnam in 50 years, but Afghanistan, is that one of the lessons?
Absolutely. That certainly is the lessons, and one of the lessons. And we haven't touched on another point here, which has to be raised within the Obama/Afghanistan context, and that is Pakistan, because that's where the nuclear weapons are. And as you and I have discussed in the past any number of times, one of the major reasons we're involved in Afghanistan to begin with has to do with keeping an eye up close on Pakistan's nuclear stockpiles and to make absolutely sure that terrorists don't get their hands on them. And that is the underlying theme, the underlying message. When Obama first came in, they came up with this idea of AFPAC, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And that was Dick Holbrooke's idea, that you had to see the two of them together. You could not separate the two. And what the president is doing right now, in his speech anyway, is almost make a move towards separation, and they can't be separated.
Are we almost ready to go to questions? Who has the microphone? Nobody has the microphone.
Well, Bernie had the microphone.
Well, no, he had one. He had one.
There they are, right there.
Yeah. Okay. We've got the microphone. I'm always inclined to say I find it sometimes difficult to get the first person to ask a question. So let's skip the first question and go right to the second question. Microphones? Go ahead.
I have a question. In 2020 hindsight, do you feel that the Vietnam War was a complete mistake? And are we making that mistake now in Afghanistan? The presidents are not learning the lessons of the past?
Oh. Today is Friday, so I tend on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to answer that question with a yes. But on weekends and Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'm not sure. And the fact of the matter is I'm really not sure. I personally am not sure. I've studied this the way other people have, and I sometimes think that there are good reasons why we are there, and the nuclear stockpile in Pakistan may be, in an underlying way, the most powerful reason why we are there, and have to be close to the scene where something very dramatic and horrible could take place. On the other hand, if you've been involved in a war for 10 years, you can certainly say to yourself, as Senator Aiken did many years ago in Vietnam, you won, you did the best you could, and then you leave. Walter Cronkite said that in February of 1968, and Lyndon Johnson said to himself at that point, well, I lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the heartland of America, and therefore I can't continue the war anymore. And I thought the other day with Obama that there was a little bit of that in his speech. There was a little bit of that. What are we doing here? And he spoke about it. Other people think that, not he, but it was there.
We've got a couple of questions up front here and one over there, wherever the microphone is closest.
Here we go, there's one right there.
All right.
Rick, there's one right behind you.
Rick, right behind you.
Yeah, this question may be actually a little far afield, and hopefully you won't yell at me. But one of the other things that I think grew out of Vietnam is how America gets its war coverage. And I wonder if you might speak about that. I haven't had a chance to read the book. I've only had it in my hands an hour, and, you know, I haven't read too much of it.
You've been doing other things in that hour?
Well, the roast beef was really good at the table, and, you know, it kind of kept me occupied. But you know, Vietnam, I was only at the very tail of it. The officers that I met and that we came in contact with at the very end of the war and as we came through the war, they were very junior officers, and as they have grown up and to become the senior officers today, their experience with the way the media dealt with them during Vietnam has really formed the way they want to deal with the media today. And all these press pools and all these restrictions and all these new methods of the way the media will be handled grow out of what is a frustration, I think, and a feeling that the media ran rampant in Vietnam, and a way that they weren't going to let it run rampant in any other conflict. And as you saw coverage change through Gulf Wars and to currently the way it's handled in Afghanistan and handled in Iraq, I mean, those are also offshoots of the Vietnam War, where you guys know better than I. You could go wandering off in the jungle if you wanted.
Rick, I'm going to use you as an example because you're an old and dear friend. No speeches, just ask a question.
Well, I want you to talk about that. I mean, because I think that's one of the legacies.
Good.
No, you talk about it. You know it better than I.
No. It's your book, your moment.
Well, Rick, the coverage of a war today, because of the pervasiveness of the media, is a central concern of any responsible leader. And at the beginning of the Iraq War, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld and his press assistant secretary for public affairs, I forgot her name right now, Tory Clark had this idea about embedding reporters with the soldiers. It was an extremely important thing. Ted was embedded with soldiers in the Iraq War. And why it was important, because we went from a draft to a volunteer army at the end of the Vietnam War into everything that followed. When you had a draft, you could have demonstrations, and you could run into a severe domestic problem. When you have a volunteer army, it's only about 1% of the American people that's involved in defending 99% of the people. So there isn't that same level of concern, and people, a lot of reporters had no idea what soldiers went through. No idea whatever, because they themselves did not serve in the military. And they, unless you're a Pentagon correspondent, you don't know very much about it. So there has been an effort on the part of the Pentagon to bring the press in. Now, that can be way overdone to a point where the press becomes a prisoner. My brother said in a program many years ago that the press was a prisoner of the Pentagon and would see only what the Pentagon wanted it to see. But at the same time, there were other reporters, freelance people, unilaterals as they're called, going in and doing a terrific job, telling the American people what it is that was going on. But the point about the media is a very important one, and I take it fully.
Let me, if I may, just add
Please.
one observation to that. And this, I think, is very much a child of Vietnam and one of the other haunting legacies of Vietnam. It is not simply the fact that you now have a volunteer army where you had an army of draftees during Vietnam. It has been taken one step further. You now have thousands of civilian contractors. Much of the warfare is now being waged by remote control, by drones. Libya is a perfect example. There are no boots on the ground in that famous phrase, right? So if the draft was one reason why there was so much political opposition here in the United States back in the 60s, that was largely removed by making, as Marvin says, a volunteer army. It is now being taken to a whole new step, which is a wonderful way of concealing military action that the government is taking.
Absolutely.
Question up front, and then we'll go over here.
It's a question right there, too.
It's right behind you, sir.
That's okay. I got it. That's okay. I'm not going to go back to it. Hi, my name is Hugh Grindstaff. I'm a Vietnam veteran, and I also have been keeping watch on what's happening with the wars. One of the things is right now, when you were reporting from Vietnam and everyone else in here was watching it from Vietnam, the war was center stage. The war was the headline for the night. Now we have Wienergate, and these guys are still dying the same way we did in Vietnam. So how do you get the focus back on the war? The more people know about the war, the sooner they want the war over, get it back. And we should never have gone into Iraq while we were in Afghanistan. That just made Afghanistan last longer and longer and longer.
You know that I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. You're absolutely right that we are more preoccupied today, given the nature of the media, with trivia than we were back then, because there wasn't that much time. You had 3 networks back then covering the war. There were the 3 networks, and that was it. Now you've got 3 cable networks that are on all the time. So they have to fill the time.
Many more than 3.
Many more than 3. Yeah. Okay. So, but you have to fill that time. That's 24 hours a day, so they're prepared to put on, forgive me, just about anything.
If I may, Marvin, there is another major reason, 2 other major reasons. If you heard the president in his speech on Afghanistan, what was he talking about? He was talking about money. He was talking about the need to apply the money that we had to our domestic agenda. He wasn't talking about the dead in Iraq or the dead in Afghanistan. And there are 2 reasons for that. A, because in Vietnam, there were weeks when we had 300 weeks when we had 300 dead and more. And they were the sons of, there were very few daughters in those days, they were the sons of people all around the country because it was a draft. That made a huge difference. I'm sorry, Debbie?
Well, I think one thing, I mean, you make a really good point about just the changes in the media over that period of time, because I remember recently watching, maybe a year or two ago, my father/co-author brought some videos from back from the 60s and 70s when he was on the CBS News, and I was just really struck by the amount of very serious discussion of issues that was going on, and the sound bites went on for longer. People were allowed to speak for longer, and they really got much more in depth on issues.
Absolutely.
And it just really struck me because at the time I was, you know, a child watching this, and I wasn't getting as much out of it as I am now. But yeah, just the amazing change in the focus of what's being covered.
We've got time for 2 more questions. We'll
Dr.
take one
Eisner,
from
right
this
in the
end.
middle there.
Thank you. You had mentioned that there was such a remarkable difference in the way different presidents responded, which was not necessarily politically or according to their political parties. Is there any suggestion that the response of one president was predicated on what had happened with the previous president's response?
Yes. Yes. Each one learns from the other. Reagan, for example, came up with the whole idea of what became the Powell Doctrine. That was a period of sort of gestation of 10 years. He thought about that, and then the next guy in line, George H.W. Bush, picked that theme up absolutely, 100%. When you got to Clinton, the lesson he learned from that was not to take it and double and triple it, but to take it and drop it like a hot potato, which is what he did with Somalia right after Black Hawk Down, that episode. So the answer to your question is yes, they do learn from one another. And when Bush 2 came in, he was in effect saying, Vietnam be damned. He also took a very negative view. He wasn't going to deal with Vietnam. And yet, when his national security advisor, second one, Stephen Hadley, came in, Hadley told us that he would not take the job until he had gone to see President Bush, and he told him that he was worried that we're facing another Vietnam in Iraq, and Hadley didn't want to have any part of that. So he told Bush, if that's what you're thinking of, if that's the way you see our policy evolving, I'll say no to the job offer. And this is a very honorable lawyer who would never say no to a president, but he did. Bush assured him that he recognized the danger, and he said, this will not happen with me. And so he took the job. So yes, it does get picked up from one to another.
Where's the microphone over here? There we go.
Thank you very much. I want to raise 2 questions.
Would you hold the mic a little closer, please?
I want to raise 2 questions regarding your assertion about the Afghan-Pakistan relationship and our own interest in it, because I think it's central to much of what we actually do in the coming months. First, I would question whether 10 years ago the existence of nuclear weapons in Pakistan was a consideration of any consequence in our entry into the war against Afghanistan. I don't think so. No. And then again now, one of the problems we have when we deal with foreign policy is we conjure up our own views of what the problem is and how it ought to be solved. And I would suggest that part of our problem today in Afghanistan is that we do not see the fight against the Taliban or Al-Qaeda in the same way that the Afghanis do. And the Afghanis, I do not believe, are concerned about Pakistan's nuclear weapons. I'd like your comments on that.
I agree with you. I don't think that the Pakistani nuclear weapons had very much, if anything, to do with the way in which we responded, the way President Bush II responded. Absolutely. That came later. That came later when they were thinking of elaborating on a policy. What are we really doing there? But at the very beginning, it was simply a quick response to a horrific attack on the United States. The second part of the second question, the idea that the Taliban is thinking about Pakistani nuclear weapons, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if sophisticated Taliban are thinking in those terms. Not at all. I don't think the average guy is thinking about it, but the average guy in this country doesn't think about it either. I think it takes extraordinary leadership and intelligent leadership to see the full depth, the drive of history in determining what it is that you do today. I mean, one of the sad parts of Vietnam over and over again was how ignorant our leaders were about what was going on there. And I would venture to add, I'm not sure that we're all that smart about what's going on in Afghanistan today.
Debbie, closing thought?
Well, I guess just a general closing thought is that it's been a real pleasure to work on a book with my father. I've really learned a lot from him. And thanks to my uncle, who's really helped a lot too.
That's it? You left out your mother.
Of course, well, my mother, my husband, my son, my stepson, everybody.
Well, you've been a delight. You've been a delightful audience, and I'm afraid we have run out of time, run out of not questions, I know, but I have been told that for every book you buy, Mr. and Ms. Kalb will entertain another question. 10 books, 10 questions. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.